Welcome to the Education Innovators Podcast. I'm Eric Byron, and it is my privilege to host this show where I get to talk to folks from all over the world who are education thought leaders and innovators. We'll hear inspiring stories from educators, EdTech founders, AI experts, and others who are fearlessly innovating and delivering unique learning experiences. I'm glad you're here. Let's get started. Our guest today is Romy Alexandra, and she is truly a global thought leader and expert in experiential learning and humanizing learning spaces.
For 5 years of my life, I was basically bouncing around Eastern, Western, Central Europe, designing programs that would bring together educators from sometimes 11 or 15 different countries and from such different cultural backgrounds. And it would be so fascinating because you'd have such unique lenses on what does emotional intelligence-based leadership mean in one country's culture or in another, or with one dynamic demographic versus another.
Romy's experience spans education in schools and learning development in corporations. She explains experiential learning in a way that really connected some dots for me, and I'm just sure you're going to get a ton out of this conversation. Keep listening. All right. I'm Eric Byron. Welcome to the Education Innovators Podcast. I am joined today with Romy Alexandra. So she is a learning experience designer and experiential learning trainer on a mission to humanize learning spaces. She is passionate about designing and delivering transformative learning experiences. Welcome to the show, Romy.
Thank you so much, Eric. So nice to be here with you today.
Yeah. So, and you are in Spain at the moment?
Currently, at the moment, I kind of call myself a global citizen these days, but you're catching me at this moment in Spain. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for taking time out of your day to spend some time with us and chat about all things experiential learning. So let's jump right in. I don't want to waste any time here. We're going to go right at this. So I've talked on the show before. We talked quite a bit actually about the difference between active and passive learning pedagogies, but we're going to focus on experiential learning here. So I'm hoping you can help us define what is and what isn't experiential learning.
Yes, great. So there are a lot of misconceptions about it. A lot of people in different spaces see it as different things. I'd say in the most general sense, when we think about an experience defined by David Kolb, who's really the founder of experiential learning theory, who I was fortunate to study with. He defined an experience as anything new that strikes the learner. Strikes meaning it taps into novelty, it's something dynamic, it taps into the 5 senses, it requires presence. So it's not something that you're going to be doing every day, right? Then you're in autopilot mode. An experience is something that really strikes you because it's new, it's different, it requires you to be fully present. And when we think about experiential learning, it's really tapping into this cycle of learning, which is typically actually how our brain learns naturally, that gets an experience and reflects on that experience, draws conclusions and thinks about that experience to then think about how you can use that experience moving forward. So again, when we think about the definition of experiential learning, it's the process whereby knowledge is transferred through this experience. And it's really thinking about an interesting dynamic mode between when are we taking in new experiences, grasping new experiences, and when are we also transforming those experiences either through reflection or action. And that's a little bit of a preview, but I can give you more examples depending on where your curiosity is today.
Well, I'm all about examples. So yeah, feed me some examples. What isn't? Give me an example of something that somebody might be confused if they go, oh, we're doing experiential learning here. And you would go, nah, it doesn't qualify.
Great question. So there's too many misconceptions that experiential learning has to happen outside of the classroom, and that experiential learning is synonymous with either outdoor adventure-based learning or that experiential learning is connected to like learning on the job, like internships, which are another way of learning. All of those are great modalities and facets that can be baked under this higher umbrella of experiential learning, but they don't define it uniquely. And the other thing I'll say is that in order to, again, because it's an experience, it's not something you do every day. So in the most bare bones, basic form of experiential learning, you could actually have a really interesting breakout room conversation if you're virtual that for some reason would tap something new into you, would strike the learner, they'd have to reflect on it. They might ask more questions and then think about, how might I take that perspective moving forward? But it wouldn't be considered experiential learning if it's a conversation that you have all the time. Like, what do you do? This is what I do, right? We're an autopilot. We're not really tapped into curiosity. Again, that's why I go back into the more that we use senses or emotions. If somebody bring an object to the screen that defines, I don't know, what experiential learning means to you. All of a sudden you're thinking in new ways of, ooh, what is that? Like I would say, I love to use the example of a cup because I say experiential learning is not about filling your learners as if they're empty cups that need to be filled, but it's actually about creating a process where you're recognizing and acknowledging that every single person who walks into your sessions are full cups of life experience that you can also drink from. And so the more you get people sharing different perspectives, that's what it is. But one last example to wrap up is that, as I said, it's not something so complicated. This is how our brain is naturally learning. So you just gave the example of I'm in Spain and I'm often, because I'm just someone who's passionate about languages, I'm trying to learn different languages wherever I am. So it could happen that I walk down the street where I am right now and I hear somebody share a word in Spanish. I don't know, ¿qué tal? Maybe I learned at school, ¿cómo estás? Which means, how are you? But I heard somebody say, ¿qué tal? So that's a new experience that, what does this mean? I start reflecting. Maybe I even have a conversation with the person, like, what does ¿qué tal mean? Tell me a little bit more about that. They give me the definition. Oh, now I understand. This is just slang to mean, how are you? Now, to complete the learning cycle, I just need to use it. The next time I see somebody down the street, I might say, hey, ¿qué tal? Oh, yeah, I put my learning into practice. It's such a simple process, and this is how our brain naturally learns. It's just what I'm really passionate is helping other people operationalize this in a really innovative new way.
Very interesting. I love that analogy of everybody has a cup and it's already got stuff in it, and we can kind of drink from each other's cup. I love that because, this is part of how I kind of operate in the world anyway. I've been known to say life is a set of experiences. And, I've always been, it's about the stories you can tell. Right? All the different things
Definitely.
you've done. And if you collect those experiences, you're a wiser, broader, person, more interesting and many different perspectives. So, but this idea that yes, everybody comes in with their own set of experiences to share and to learn from, I think that's a great perspective on, we don't have to fabricate things all the time, right? We can just
Yeah.
go, hey, tell me a story, right? Your story may be a new experience for me, right? And hopefully we have some dialogue about what that experience meant to you, right? Why did you share that story, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I think unfortunately, learn education and learning has become really transactional, has been either I'm in the teaching role and then I'm delivering content and you're listening, or you're answering a question or you're giving me something and I'm listening. And so what I'm really passionate about is kind of reformulating the spaces, whether they're in-person, online, or hybrid learning spaces that really feel co-creative, collaborative. Like I said, where you can, if you'd like to, as an educator, create a new experience. You and I talked about your passion for games in the past, right? Like you can create a game right here, which is a unique shared experience that then we all would reflect on and we all would draw conclusions and then think about how we take it forward. And we also want to recognize all of the past lived experiences that people bring to the room, because those diverse perspectives, and like you said, those stories, hearing from different people's, it's great if there's debate and people says, no, that's not, maybe somebody challenges me and says, no, I don't believe that. Okay, great. Tell me more. What is your experience? And that's how you really create such a much more empowering learning space for people to really own their own learning potential.
Yeah. All right, so something popped in my head too as we were talking about this, probably because I've been working on an article on it, but AI simulated personalities.
Mhm.
So I know there's some people who love it and some people who hate it, which is why I'm writing about it. But I'm curious from your perspective. So if we're encouraging, and I've been playing with Khan Academy's Migo, right? I think they
Mm,
have 60 or 70 different historical figures or fictional characters who it can impersonate, right? So you go in and you can have
mhm.
a discussion with them. Would you consider that to be experiential learning? If I'm going in as I did and I had a chat with Winston Churchill, right? Um,
So, thank you so much for bringing this up because it touches upon one more common misconception that people have about experiential learning, which is that experiential learning is just learning by doing. And I often say that we need to differentiate these two because we can learn by doing anything, right? That might be the example you just gave with AI and having a conversation with Winston Churchill. Great. That might be a new experience, or that might be something I'm learning as I'm going through it, whether or not I was aware or not. But it's not considered experiential learning unless I've gone through the full cycle that I expressed before, where now I've had that experience with AI. Now have I taken time to reflect on it, either for myself individually, what am I taking away from that conversation with Winston Churchill, or I have a conversation with a colleague about it. What new insights can be extracted that we can generalize? Sometimes in that thinking phase is more content delivery that comes up afterwards, or even is just an extension of the debrief of, okay, what did I take from this that is actually applicable or relevant to my day-to-day life? Because you might think, oh, Winston Churchill is something from the past, but hey, how is that impacting our current reality right now? And then we need to go into that action space because otherwise we'll say, so what? I had a conversation with Winston Churchill. Sure, these were my takeaways. This is interesting how it's relevant to today's modern day. But if I leave there, then I'm going to say, so what? Why did I do this? And that's why we need to take it forward and say, what are my insights from that I've just reflected on that I can use now? Is there anything that Winston Churchill told me that is relevant to my day to day that might be relevant to how I don't know in what context you're talking about Winston Churchill? Maybe it has to do with politics and it has to do with something else. Who knows? But something that then I can take forward myself outside of this AI world into my day to day life. Then I know that I've gone through the full cycle of experiential learning, if that makes sense.
yeah, no, that does. I like that distinction too, that it's not really learning unless you can apply it in some way. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
That's that like transformation, right? Have
yeah.
those experiences, then I need to reflect on that and then apply it in order to really transform it.
Mm, perfect. All right. Let's talk about humanizing learning spaces. So this is a phrase you use. It's actually in your profile, right? Your mission to humanize learning spaces. So can you give me, an example of what that means, what it looks like?
Yeah, I mean, so many different ways, but I think at the very bare bones basics, I realized very early on in my journey into experiential learning that before we even get into designing around the cycle or tapping into different approaches or, empowering learning flexibility, as we like to say, the foundation is the learning space. And so much of that comes with psychological safety. It comes with how am I creating the conditions in the container in which everyone here feels that they can ask questions, whether or not they feel stupid, which we always say there's no such thing, right? But even if you just tell me there's no such thing as stupid questions, okay, it's one thing to say it or tell me this is a safe space. It really doesn't mean anything until you start to show me in your actions and put it into practice. And so a lot of what I do, in addition to training, you name it, organizations, individuals, teams on experiential learning, is also about psychological safety. How do we create environments where people feel we can have these hard, open conversations where we can even disagree, we can debate, we can have conflict, we can work through feedback together? How do we create spaces where everyone feels they're included and they belong, whether they're you name it, whether they're a marginalized individual, whether they come from a different background, whether they are on the scale of neurodivergence. There's so many areas that we need to be more aware of and open to and how we design our programs. And And I think it's just about encouraging everyone to, again, harness their own, take ownership in their learning process and make sure that we're creating the conditions that they can do that. As well as, of course, things like risk and failure and making sure that learning is such a risky thing. It's very vulnerable to learn when you think about it at the end of the day, because learning happens outside of our comfort zone. It happens in our stretch zone. We need to be creating spaces where we empower our learners to set their boundaries, where they know where they're able to push themselves outside into that challenge stretch zone, and where also it might be too far for them into their panic zone, where no learning will happen because they'll be in fight, flight, freeze response. So these are just a few things that I'm constantly thinking about. How are we creating the conditions for psychological safety up front, but also how are we weaving throughout every aspect of the learning journey more opportunities for connection? As human beings, we need social connection. A huge reason why so many people take self-paced courses but never complete them is because it's not about the information that they're really excited to learn. What holds them accountable in the course to actually to completion is that community space, is the connection. So weaving in connection, weaving in more engagement, interaction, thinking about different personality styles, whether you're an introvert, an extrovert, an ambivert, how have we designed the course so everyone feels included? Thinking about also behavior change, right? It's not enough to just think about what happens in this course, but how am I helping you take your learning forward? And a lot of that has to do with the environment that you're in, and so that you can actually make those changes. So those, I know it's a big topic, but those are some of the areas I think about when I think about really humanizing learning spaces.
Yeah. So, I mean, the piece that immediately comes to my mind, and this is, almost epidemic, I guess, in certainly in the US, is bullying. And, so you talk about creating a safe space, and we hear so many horror stories, even teachers who are, giving up and, leaving the profession because they feel threatened. They're being attacked verbally and physically by students. So, it's great to say, right? Oh, we're going to humanize, these environments, but how do you really do it? I mean, because it's got to come from all directions, right? It's not something a teacher can just dictate and say, this is now a safe space, right? Everybody really has to be on board and participating. So how?
Well, you mentioned the topic of bullying, and while I'm definitely not a bullying expert, I still think that a lot of the things that I train other educators to do are very relevant in this space. So a big part is role modeling by example. Unfortunately, like I said, when we have been conditioned in an educational environment that's very transactional, it's very much about power holding. And I did a 2-year certification program in like pedagogy of the oppressed with Paulo Freire's approach, combining that with experiential learning, and how do we address the oppression that exists even within the own education space. And a big part happens when we feel as educators, this is going to look differently in formal education, non-formal education, corporate setting, of course, but how can we create conditions that, again, help each individual take ownership over their learning? Because the more that I'm holding it tightly, the more it invites the opportunity for, let's say, a bully or somebody else to try to take the power, right? And then someone wants the power and it feels like power is something. But the more that we've designed a very co-creative learning space that recognizes each individual, what are they actually most interested to learn? I do believe that, at least within a learning space, I don't know enough about bullying as a whole, but I know it's a huge epidemic. As we said, a big reason why I think a lot of bullying happens within classrooms is because those learners are not engaged and don't feel that they can contribute. And so they find other ways to actually use their energy elsewhere. So it's like, oh, there's a lull in the classroom. There's a perfect opportunity to then like bully that person. Or, I think what I've learned, and I've dealt with, I call them the crocodiles in the classroom, the people who either need to exert their power or authority. They need to be disruptive in the classroom. They need to diminish, or let's say demoralize others in that kind of learning setting. A big part is about how I show up as an educator and show up with emotional intelligence and compassion. how I call it out, because there's a big misconception that psychological safety is just touchy-feely safe spaces, but actually you can't have one without accountability. So I also need to be able to call those things out when I see them, both taking those participants aside, either at the session, outside of the session, talking to them individually. And I'm always trying to come from it on a really empathic lens, that it's more often than not, it's the bullies who have a lot of unmet emotional needs that's actually why they're acting out. And so the more that we're able to create safe spaces where you can come to me privately, you can do this in a forum, there's different ways that we can talk about things. I've noticed the more that even I give more, not autonomy, but I give more responsibility to those crocodiles in a learning setting, because oftentimes they want to show like they know something, they're doing it. So, hey, if you know this, I'd love for you to actually come like co-facilitate the next session with me. All of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, you're putting on the spot. A lot of times those bullies just want to be seen and heard themselves. And that's the way that we either shame them and blame them will only continue for them to keep bullying others. But if we can actually call them in instead of calling them out and say, like, how can we take this and how do we make this learning program really interesting for you or motivating for you? How does it also give you even more responsibility? Then I notice that you have a lot less of those power dynamics happening.
Yeah. I've always felt my own personal experience was the bullies were usually the ones who were actually most kind of vulnerable, that they, were afraid, right? And so they don't want to be exposed as weak or scared. And so they get tough and they put on this face of try and make everybody else scared, right? If I can make you cry, then, you don't see me crying, right?
Yeah.
Kind of thing. So yeah, I really do. I love this idea of the, safe space where, I can also be vulnerable, right? Where I can say, I don't know, right? Because oftentimes in school, right, this is not really encouraged. You want the kid who raises their hand knows the answer, right? This is the behavior we encourage, right? What we don't generally encourage necessarily or make safe is the kid who raises his hand and goes, I don't get it. I don't understand. Right. It's a sign of weakness and potentially makes you a victim for the bullies. We're going to go, oh, look, you idiot. Yeah.
Exactly.
Asking
And
stupid questions. Right. Yeah. Um,
And I think
uh,
that goes back to such a great point you mentioned. I think that goes back to like, what are we acknowledging and what are we recognizing? So how are we celebrating those moments when someone says, I don't know, like, thank you so much for asking. Probably if you didn't know, there's somebody else here in the classroom who didn't.
yeah.
Or giving more acknowledgement when people say, like, I made a mistake. Thank you. Because you made a mistake, all of us can actually learn from that mistake. And really, it's always in your actions, those small actions, those phrases that really demonstrate more than like, this is a safe space to make mistakes. Don't tell me, but show me every time when that
Yeah.
happens that this is really safe to do that.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. There's so many analogies also to the workplace, but you won't drag that in. I did a study once too of that. And anyway,
What,
successful teams. And one
okay.
of the top things for successful teams was a safe environment where people could raise their hand and say, I'm scared. We're in trouble here. This is not good. Right. And people are afraid to speak up and say
Yeah.
something's not working. We're in trouble. Yes, the problems get worse.
Yeah, I mean, just based on what you just shared about the importance in the workplace, you're absolutely right. I mean, I don't work so much anymore with educators one-on-one. I work a lot in the corporate setting these days and precisely on these topics. So a lot of what I reference is Google did an extensive research study on high performing teams and the most effective teams across different companies, different cultures, excuse me, and trying to understand what is it. And ultimately, as you said, psychological safety really is the number one key differentiator for high performing teams. So this is literally what I do is I train a lot of teams. How do we create cultures of psych safety? How do we create speak up cultures? How do we encourage more risk taking and failure? It's relevant no matter what area, how old you are, because all human beings need to learn. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely very relevant there too.
Cool. In our study, actually, the number one thing was vision. So a
Mm-hmm.
shared vision in terms
Share
of
vision.
work and projects, right? So yes, when people get it and they know what I'm doing, they have that purpose to it, then yes,
Yeah.
you're much more likely to get good results out of your team. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. We often say you can't, what separates a group from a team is that they have a shared vision, right? If
Yeah.
they're if they're not, if they don't have that shared vision, then you're just a group of individuals. Doesn't really matter.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's talk about creativity because you also, I've seen something from you that talked about experience. I have such a hard time with that word. Experiential learning cultivates creativity. So
Mhm.
tell me about that. How does that work?
Well, I would like to say that they're kind of it's what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Is it the experiential learning design that cultivates more creativity in your learners, and or is it the creativity in your learners that are also encouraging even more experiences in interaction in the design? So for me, one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about experiential learning is because it creates an incredible opportunity for, whether you call yourself a learning experience designer, an educator, you name it, to really curate different modalities and creative ways of interacting with the content. Unfortunately, in the formal education system, we see far too much of lecture, presentation, question answering, reading, writing, and that's pretty much it. So what I love to do is really bake really innovative experiences into the learning process. That might be simulation games, that might be role play activities, that might be leveraging different senses. Just today, I was talking to a client and we were saying, what about the power of sense and fragrance, which is actually the scent that we have that is most connected to our long-term memory. So the more that actually, if in your sessions you're pinpointing a particular fragrance, when you bring that scent back in the test, you actually, there's studies that show that you actually tap better into the brain-based memory because the scent triggers a lot of
Yep.
the information that they learn. So even things like that, sometimes we use drawing, we use somatic practices, we use guided visualizations, we use storytelling modalities, you name it, like really trying to get as creative as possible so that people feel that there's a way for them to engage in the content. We just talked about creating safe learning spaces. One of the big reasons that I've realized why I've decided to go into this field is because I am someone, I have ADHD, and I realized very early on in my learning as a student that I didn't feel like I had a lot of flexibility, choice, or creativity in ways that I could interact with the content. It felt very rigid and actually felt really exclusive. Like it didn't feel like I could really tap into that. The more that we can empower our learners to find their way to this content, this information, these learning through different modalities, the more we unlock new ideas, the more we empower learners to tap into different creative outlets that they might have never had, because creativity is another basic human need that we have. And unfortunately, the longer we spend in our life away from kindergarten, you see the creativity really is not encouraged. So for me, they really go hand in hand in terms of how you integrate creativity in the design. But then once you do that, all the creative ideas that can kind of explode out of even one session, because it creates ripple effects of creativity forward.
Yeah. So it's interesting because it makes me think about, sorry, lose my voice a little bit there, allowing you know, everyone to create the experiences, right? So it's not, right, I'm the teacher and I've got to come up with these creative ideas for all these different modalities. It may very well be, kind of free form. Here's time, come up with an activity to do that, works for you with guidelines and guardrails, if you will. But have you seen that work? Have you seen environments where,
Totally.
yeah,
So, yes, I've seen this work in many different ways, and I find it so powerful. So, one example might be if I'm actually delivering content instead of just delivering content on, for example, if you have, what's the difference between assertive communication in comparison to aggressive or passive aggressive communication? I might divide the group into four distinct groups, divide the learners into four distinct groups, actually give them the content. Maybe I give them some written materials, some videos to watch to really understand. And then they have to create an experience to actually teach the others what is that form. So some people, some groups come and they do a role play. Some of them come and they do even not just a role play, but I'm not sure if you've seen like, what is it called? The Theater of the Oppressed kind of thing, Augusto Bell. It's really interesting where they create a role play, but then they'll say, okay, but now we stop and we pause and we ask the learners who wants to jump in and tell us how we could do it differently. And so the viewers become part of the actors, and it creates a whole new interesting dynamic experience to really correct from a aggressive communication to maybe more assertive. Or I've seen groups do like a gallery walk, and they've created like different emotional stations when they think about passive aggression and the connection between emotional understanding. And so giving more ownership, like you said, wow, I mean, there's so much potential there. Another way that I've seen this work, well, one, I mean, that I think is really important. We've talked a lot about the importance of putting your learning into practice, is giving individualized personal approaches that students are actually really motivated around. Like, what are you taking from this that is going to impact your experience moving forward? That might look differently for everyone. I shouldn't always have to say, I'm your teacher, so here's your task. It's about helping each individual learner think about what is this content that, or this learning outcome that's most relevant to my situation, maybe my career path, my goals, my, next steps, and how might they turn that into an experience in their own life. So then you could bring in something like we talked about, which would be an interview, internship, or job shadowing, or like to think about how they can even take that experience forward. And the last example I would give is, are you familiar with open space technology? Have you heard of that modality ever?
Yeah, a little bit. I wouldn't say I'm an expert, but yeah.
It's basically, for anyone who's not familiar, it's kind of like this it's basically an unconference. And so I use this again as another great way to say, if at the end of I'm thinking about teacher perspective right now, but like if at the end of semester you're thinking, hey, or at the end of a unit, right? We learned all about this particular topic, but we know that there's so much more that we could learn about with this topic. This is not the end all be all most exhaustive form. Then what I would do is create an open space where I invite my students to say, what are you actually motivated to learn? This could be a question that you pose to the group that you want to have a discussion around. This could also be an experience, an activity that you lead and you facilitate for the group, because it might be something you really want to share from your past experience. And from that, like even from a session we once did on leadership, we had people bringing in juggling and how juggling is connected to leadership. We had people bringing in really interesting modalities from football or excuse me, soccer, depending on wherever you are in the world, but football or soccer, and how that relates to leadership. And so all of a sudden, you really empower your learners to create an experience out of the content in a way that motivates them, empowers them, and honors them. I can't say this enough. It's about honoring and acknowledging them and not feeling like you just you're forcing people into a bubble. It really unlocks the box of what's possible here.
Yeah. So I love one piece of that you touched on there. So I think we talked about this before, and my kind of interest around developing curiosity, right? And so cultivating that and I want to cultivate it in both students and teachers. Right? I think we all need to be curious all the time. This is how innovation happens and stuff, right? I want answers. I want to dig deeper. I won't accept a shallow answer to something. Don't scrape the surface, deep dive, right? But sometimes we don't have the time. The facilities say there's a limited scope I can cover, but having that environment where the student can say, oh, I want to go spend some time and explore this more. I think that's, yeah, if we can create that kind of environment, that open space where you can go explore something more and then share what you learn, that's awesome. Awesome. Yeah.
And I think you make such a great point. We shouldn't only be aiming to do this with students, but we need to do this with teachers as well. I've worked with very experienced teachers who, have a wealth of knowledge. And the downside of when you've been doing something for many decades is that you start to get in a bit of a rut. You've always been doing it this way you do it. So I think you're so right. How do we encourage more schools to empower our teachers to curate that curiosity, whether it's take a week to go out of the classroom and we're paying for you to try a new experience, or to even just without financial, anything, just like there's so much you can do for free to tap into curiosity. But exactly what you said, it's not enough to just have that new experience, but come back and teach to the other educators. What did you learn? What was this new insight? You mentioned AI, right? We're all trying to learn. What did you discover about AI that we can also leverage even for those skeptics that might be in the room? All of that is what's really going to curate a lot more curiosity and empower the educators and teachers to try things in new ways as well.
Yeah, I know in the university level you have, the research, right, folks, right? So they do a combination of teaching and research. My own brother worked at Loyola University for 30 something years, and he, had a lab and did research, but he also taught. And to me, I think that's right. That is cultivating that environment, right? His job was to be curious. So, what I gotta keep poking at this until we figure out, what it is, right? And over decades long research projects. But I'm sure it came across in his teaching too that, he didn't have all the answers and we're seeking the answers all the time. And you hope that the students come away with that going, yeah, this, right, we're just touching on a subject and there's much, much more. Um, and so, yeah, I think teachers, I would hope, in a world that's changing so fast too, that the teachers would be curious and going, things are evolving so quickly. I need time myself to be curious and go research things and bring that back to share.
Well, what you shared made me think about, it goes back to what we were talked before about the learning space in the container, right? Within this rapid change that we're in, it all will depend on the environment that we're in. If educators feel empowered to try, test, get curious, explore different things and bring it back and iterate, right? And prototype. Sometimes we don't always have to have such a long research grant. I know people spend out years even doing these things, right? But it's how do we empower people to get curious in the day to day from one little tweak, one new idea, one prototype or ideation session. And I think, unfortunately, teachers have so much on their plates that everything can often feel like this is another add-on burden. I already have too much. I don't have time to do all the tasks I need to do. So this is again where it's a requirement of the schools or the institutions wherever this learning is happening, that we empower our teachers and educators to create a space where they have the time to actually get curious and go explore. Because one of the antidotes maybe to creativity is packed schedules, right? So much creativity. Our most creative ideas often happen when we're not doing anything. Most people say their creative ideas happens when they're in their shower and they're not thinking about
Yeah.
anything. So we need more spaciousness, and the learning space that we're in can either enhance that and give more spaciousness to tap into that curiosity, or can really give more constraints that feels like a burden and there's too much. So a lot of that has to do with the learning space we're in and the kind of empowering environment or not that
Yeah.
educators are in.
Are sabbaticals still a thing anymore? Used to be that, yeah, teachers could take a sabbatical. So it was basically, one term off or even a full year. And sometimes they would go and do more education, but sometimes that was, I mean, I remember in the US, right? It was, oh, my teacher took a year off and they went to Europe and explored all over Europe and just got this exposure to all these different things and history and cultures. And they came back so much more invigorated and ready to teach again. But I don't know that they do that anymore.
I'm not
Yeah.
totally sure. I'm not as connected with the formal education system like I used to. But one thing I do know is that sabbaticals are becoming a lot more trendy now, at least in the corporate setting. And so a lot of my own colleagues even have taken sabbaticals, whether it's 6 months or a year. And it's been, as you said, a great way for them to try, travel, explore, meet different people, have all these innovative new experiences that then they can come back to work and say, I'm totally refreshed, but I have so many new creative ideas that I'm really excited to put into practice. And I've seen a lot more corporate companies really encouraging those sabbaticals. So I hope that teachers and informal education also still tap into them as well.
Yeah. EA, where I worked, Electronic Arts, the video game industry, I don't know if they continued it after I left, but they had a sabbatical program there. And I want to say it was 10 years. I think when you hit your 10th anniversary with the company, you could take a like 3 month or something sabbatical. And it was just paid time, go do whatever you want. And yeah, it was one of those things people really looked forward to. But you heard some of the great stories, right? The guy who would come back from a sabbatical and they'd be like, "Oh my God, I went off and I created my own game. I had this thing in my head and I just, you know, sleepless nights making my own game." Or they traveled or they, learned to play golf or, who knows, but they did something completely outside of their normal job for a period and then they came back ready to roll up their sleeves and get back to work. Um, yeah,
And how inspiring, right? And that really,
yeah,
I'm sure, inspires so many people to hear what others did when they were gone and brings new ideas. And so that's why I love that that was a norm in the place that you were working, because that really breeds innovation further.
yeah, yeah. They also experimented with the thing, and I think this also came out of Google, where you gave people either like a 1 day a week or 2 weeks every quarter or something where they could take on their own personal project, right? And just go do it. And people could team up and say, all right, we're both gonna take our 2 weeks off at the same time and go work on this thing together because I don't have all the skills to do what I want to do. But what they found was that almost all of the problems they solved were common problems. Most of them were almost operational, right? It was like, I just need a better way to do this at work, but I don't have time to solve it because I'm up to my eyeballs in work all the time. But I can picture teachers having the same kind of thing, right? If you just said to teachers, look, we're going to, do something else with your classes for the next 2 weeks. You go, whatever it is you want to work on, what makes your life easier, what problem can you solve? Here's 2 weeks, go do it. You know, doesn't have to be 6 months or, a full sabbatical. Maybe it just needs to be a couple of weeks. Yeah.
Yeah. Hearing you say that, I'm kind of envisioning this red thread that almost connects everything we've been talking about up until now, which is really about the power of co-creation, right? Creating those spaces for people to actually tap into what's missing. What are the problems that we're not even seeing? How do we give you the agency and the ownership to actually fix the solution by yourself and co-create it with us?
Yeah.
It's kind of the red thread with everything we're talking about. The more we can give people the space, and again, it's not like, we live in this society that's so much about hierarchy, right? And so I understand the need to hold on to the power that you have, but you're so right. The more we kind of open up those spaces for co-creation, the more I ask as a leader or as an educator, what am I missing? What's not what's happening? All of a sudden the students will bring those same ideas forward, the same way staff will bring ideas forward, the same way people start to feel safe because all of a sudden we're creating something together. And I just love that vision or the image that you just painted about what really happens when you give people those opportunities. You actually don't it's not just about individual gain, it's really about the collective gains. And so I really want to tap more into co-creation in the formal education system, because I do this a lot in my own work. Everything I do requires co-creation, and it makes all the difference when you think about designing and delivering really impactful learning spaces.
Yeah. Cool. All right. So you've been doing this, I think you commented earlier, all over the place, right? I think your full bio, it says something about facilitating training in 40 different countries. So what stands out to you as some of the most innovative, interesting learning experiences that you've seen?
Well, I'd say the more that we can create cross-cultural learning experiences, again, the more creative and the more interesting those experiences are. I mean, for 5 years of my life, I was basically bouncing around Eastern, Western, Central Europe, designing programs that would bring together educators from sometimes 11 or 15 different countries and from such different cultural backgrounds. And it would be so fascinating because you'd have such unique lenses on what does, what does emotional intelligence based leadership mean in one country's culture or in another, or with one dynamic demographic versus another. And I just think that it's not necessarily about one particular. I think this actually goes without saying for anything I do. It's not about one particular experience. I could have a favorite game that I love, but ultimately it's always the people that make or break that experience. And what I found is that even if you think you're offering, on the shelf lesson plans, they're never, ever, no matter how much you try, going to be exactly the same, because you're always going to have different people in the room. You're always going to have different questions, different motivations, different inspiration, different people bringing new ideas forward, right, in that co-creation process. And so what I found is the more we can tap into really diverse backgrounds, whether that's cultural backgrounds, whether it's religious backgrounds, whether it's ethnic backgrounds, whether you name it, the more diversity that we have, the more rich the learning environment is. Because again, like we go back to the beginning, everyone's coming in with their own background experience, and it brings a whole new dynamic lens. So it's not one, I can't really pinpoint that this is my favorite learning experience, because it always will change depending on who's in the room. And that for me is a big part of what it means to humanize these learning spaces, is designing with our participants in mind and embracing, we always say, you want to have a balance of structure, right? We want to make sure we've designed our program, but we also want to have this open space for spontaneity, that in case this group says, no, we're way more interested here, we're going to throw that structure out and let's focus on what you are actually motivated and passionate and interested in. Let's spend more time there. And having that flexibility is what really unlocks really exciting learning experiences, I think.
Yeah. So what about, sorry, I'm going to press this a little bit because I believe there's an answer somewhere there on maybe not a specific experience or experiential learning exercise, but an environment, someplace you've been where they get it. They really do this, well, and it's become part of the culture to do these kind of experiences and to look at education this way. Anywhere in particular that kind of stands out as a place, and I know some of it's like system too, right? That the school system has to embrace this, and leadership has to be saying, go do this, be creative, come up with these experiences. Any place you've found where this just seems to be kind of more naturally happening?
Not necessarily naturally happening. I mean, it's hard for me to say because my role, right? So I have my own training consulting business. So a big part is that teams bring me in when they need this and they ask me to facilitate this process. So it's
Right.
so usually I'm coming in when there's been, identified a need for this. But in the education space, what I can say is that I had a really amazing experience when I was at some point in my life. When I first came to Spain, I was actually an English teacher in Spain, but I said, I'm probably the worst English teacher you're ever going to get, because I'm a native English speaker. And I never was trained as a foreign language teacher. So when students would ask me, like, why in English is it like this, not like this? I'd say, I don't know, it just sounds better. So I realized very early on, I'm not going to be the best English teacher. But what I appreciated was that I worked with an incredible high school in a very small rural area in Galicia in Spain. And I presented this idea to them. As I said, listen, I've just spent the last 6, 7 years at this point, really diving into experiential learning. I don't think that I'm going to be the best English teacher you can imagine, but what I can do is curate really innovative English classes based on experiential learning theory. So the school, I have to say, was so open and receptive, and saw that this was a unique experience for these students in a really rural part of this part of Spain to get contact with a native English speaker. They were just excited that I wanted to make it a more interactive experience. So ultimately what we did was we actually or what I did, but was, tap into topics that I heard students asking about and also that I was interested in. And say, okay, instead of we're teaching you English grammar, this week I know with another English teacher, it's all about culture. So I would do this culture simulation game activity in English. Some students would be, able to speak more and communicate more, some people less. But again, it was always, I'd say when it's my sessions, I am not grading you in the formal way about your writing, your reading. This is about communicating and speaking. Just show me the effort that you're trying, and we're here to help you along the way. We would do these culture simulation games where one group, can only communicate by looking in the eyes, and the other group is blindfolded and can't look in the eyes. So how do you find ways to communicate, right? All of these different ways to showcase cultural differences, and how do you find ways to still appreciate and respect cultural differences, but still find ways to find communal understanding. Or we do different exercises like tapping into your own personal values, and we do I'd write all these values on a piece of paper, and I'd call it the values bazaar, and they'd have to kind of trade and find their best values, and then they'd have to narrow it down until ultimately they could pick their top 3 values. And then they'd have to really define it. What does it mean to you? Because it's not enough to just know what your value is, but we need to be able to define it as a commitment to something, so in your day-to-day life if you're living by your values. And ultimately, this school was just so open and receptive to me bringing in these really different approaches. And the students loved it. I mean, I received such wonderful, very kind comments, and just, I really just beautiful. It created a really beautiful community for me to even be a part of, because I could bring in this approach. And they were even open to me then doing these kind of competitions with students that said, just again, it's about how you practice the language. Because unfortunately, I went to school, I studied French for 6 years. Don't even ask me to say anything in French to you. I couldn't tell you. When unfortunately so much of the learning environments for languages happens with reading and writing and not just communicating and speaking. So again, this school was really open to me saying, hey, if I write grants to the European Union and we can get these students on these international training programs with me, then they're able to see why they need to be speaking English, because in their day-to-day life, they don't need it. Everyone speaks Spanish or Galician. But the moment that they came to me to Croatia or to Lithuania or to Jordan, or you name it, many different countries, with other students their age who the only common language was English, they realized this is why I'm learning English, is because it really opens doors. So I really appreciate that particular school that was open and innovative, but I know that there's so many out there. It's just so much comes down to the mindset that educators take within this learning space to tap into curiosity, ideation, right? All of the creativity, all of that can really, change the trajectory. I'll stop speaking after this, but I just met up with one of my students from that school last week, and now he's 22. And I met him when he was 16 years old, and he said, I want you to know you completely changed my life, because he had never been on a plane before. And now his passion, because he really was encouraged to keep practicing English. He's traveled so much. He's now writing his own grants to the European Commission. He's now leading his own training programs and empowering other students. It was Croatia a couple of weeks ago, leading a whole training on emotional intelligence for international students across, 6 different countries. So it all creates ripple effects depending on the mindset that we take. You never know what kind of new, innovative, open ideas you'll navigate and open up for everybody else.
Yeah. Well, you touched on another one of my favorite themes. So I just call it bravery, right? Another thing I want to cultivate in both students and teachers, right? That risky, I don't know what's going to happen, but we're going to go try, right? And if we fail, okay, what did we learn? But here we go again, right? Say, even if it didn't work, we must have learned something from it. Let's be fearless and go at this again, right? And keep going at it until we find something that works. But this is not something that at least public schools in many areas really embrace, right? Fear of failure, this is a very common theme. And so, I really think that when we see great innovators in education, they're also very much fearless and brave. And I think it's a requirement. It's got to be a requirement for teachers to be, yes, to be brave and innovate, and students to be brave and try new things, right? We're always telling them, just try it, right? My mother, serving foods I'd never seen before, and we're all looking at it, go, oh, no, I don't want to eat that. She's like, try it, no, right? You got to try it.
Yeah.
Maybe you'll like it, right? So, yeah,
Totally.
yeah.
Love that.
All right. Any last thoughts, things you want to share? Anything we didn't talk about? You just got to get out there in the world?
I feel like we talked about a lot of different things. I think just, hitting on the very last point you said is this is a great invitation to anyone who's watching this, right? To be brave, to try new things, experiment. Remember that I love to say, right? Fail just means first attempt in learning. And that's exactly why we want to be empowering our learners in the learning process, not just to get good grades. Like I really was so studious myself as a student. I really cared about grades. But being so studious actually kind of beat out that love of learning for me over time. And I'm so glad I found it. I found it again. And now it's my job to help others reawaken it within them. But I think the more we can tap into that intrinsic motivation, passion, getting curiosity and creativity in the mix, being brave, experimenting, prototyping, iterating, all of that is going to unlock new ways to navigate learning experiences and learning spaces. And so if you're ever feeling, I'm not sure if this will work for the group, then I say usually that's a good sign. If there's butterflies, that means you should go for it.
Yes.
And if ever you're in doubt, then co-create, bring people in so you don't feel alone and get their perspective, see how other people can support you. I just think that's the future of learning. It has to be collaborative and co-creative.
Yeah. Well, and I think you have to engage the learners too, right?
Yeah.
It, the best ideas, and this is true in the corporate world too, right? Best ideas rarely come from corporate leadership. They, they bubble up. They come from the people who are really doing the stuff, day to day. And so, same thing for teachers. I think, you want to try something new, engage with the students and ask them for their ideas, their
Yes.
input. What do you want to do? What do you want to try? Yeah.
When in doubt, I always say when in doubt, ask more. Ask first, then tell. You may have a great idea that you're so excited to bring, but before you tell people, just ask them, what do you think?
Yeah.
What are you interested in? What do you need? What do you think of this idea? I think the more questions we ask, the more impactful we can be as educators.
Yeah. And even if it's a good idea, they'll make it better. Right.
Always, 1,000%,
Yeah.
100%, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Romy. This has been really fun and really interesting. Yeah, this was kind of a new topic for my podcast. And so yeah, I think it resonates really well, and you call it kind of tied things together really nicely. Some other things in my brain, I talk a lot about games, and I just had Joel on, talked about Lego serious play, again, very tactile, kind of
Great,
thing, but
great.
it's the same sort of, be creative, yeah. So yeah, it doesn't always have to be some highly well-formed, wrapped experience. It can be kind of loose and free form, and people will find their
Hmm.
own learning out of it. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Awesome.
I always say the beauty of experiential learning is that we all can have the exact same experience, but we all will have totally different takeaways. So I think your comment just now
Yeah.
perfectly exemplifies that. Well, thank
Great.
you so much, Eric. It was so lovely meeting you, and thank you for this
Yeah.
opportunity. And excited that it brought up some new ideas for you too,
Yeah.
moving
Yeah.
forward.
No, this is great. And well, have fun on your vacation. I know you said you've
Thank
got
you.
a week before your vacation. So I hope that's a
Yeah.
lovely break for you too, to refresh and re-energize, ready to go at it again. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. Appreciate it, and
All
we'll be in
right.
touch soon.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Wow, so much to process there. Romy really got me thinking about experiential learning in a different way than I had before. And she reminded me of the importance of psychological safety and of creating those safe places or safe spaces for learning to occur. And I love this concept of students not being treated as if they're just an empty vessel that we need to fill, right? These are individuals who come to the experience with all of their own, contributions to make. So this also leads us into this thought process we just talked about here, with how collaboration is so important in these experiences, and that it's the collaboration that really brings out the creativity, and allows the learners the freedom to be curious. I also love that Romy reinforced that this is about the full cycle, right? It's experiential learning when we have the chance to process, analyze, internalize, and then apply what we learned through the experience, and that experience is unique to each individual, even if they're in the same space at the same time. So this is just great stuff from Romy Alexandra. Thank you so much, Romy. All right, I'm Eric Byron. Thanks for listening to the Education Innovators podcast. I hope that you'll subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the button, because we've got so much more great content coming. Incredible stories of innovation and education. So thanks again to all those education innovators out there. I'm still looking for more stories, so come and talk to me. Let's get you on the show. But thanks for doing what you do. You are making a difference.